In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 14, in which we go over external costs, where, looking ahead, currently we are seeking how a government can intervene in a given product or factor market when given a particular market structure, which was the discussion of our last chapter, and 2, when third parties are affected by transactions from a market, which is the discussion of this chapter, where, in regards to this chapter, we seek to examine government intervention for when third parties are affected by markets through the example of pollution, where we will do so by considering external costs as well as regulation options, where in regards to today's discussion on external costs, we will do so by setting up some preliminaries in order to discuss pollution as well as external costs, where, beginning with our preliminaries, having gone through consumer theory, we have gained insight on product demand, and having gone through the theory of the firm, we've gained insight on product supply, where we then used the two and examined market equilibrium given alternative market structures in order to gain insight on how market structure assumptions alter the equilibrium level of output as well as the price point for a particular product or service, where now we are concerned with how the government can intervene in a market given market failure existing or marginal cost pricing not holding, where we saw in our last chapter market failure occurred if marginal cost pricing did not hold, where using the natural monopoly as our example market structure, we saw how a government could use regulation to achieve marginal cost pricing for the market, where this led to the regulation options of if price regulation was used, then marginal cost pricing held, but a subsidy was required. If output regulations were used, marginal cost pricing did not hold, and monitoring costs were needed. And lastly, if profit regulations were used, then marginal cost pricing did not hold, and monitoring costs were also required. Where overall then what we concluded was there was no straightforward way to regulate the market structure given, and that some trade-off had to be made between an imperfect market or an imperfect regulation. Now we seek to do a similar analysis, but from the perspective of if we have a market of consumers and firms who engage in transactions that also affect non-market participants, what does that mean for the market outcome? Should the government intervene, and how should the government intervene if they decide to? So we will do this analysis through the example of pollution in markets, where we will define pollution as the addition of any substance or form of energy to the environment at a rate faster than it can be dispersed of in a harmless form, where pollution overall is harmful to the environment in that more is being added than what can be taken away, and this will lead to environmental damage as well as impaired health to people as well as to animals, where common forms of pollution will include air pollution, water pollution, as well as solid waste pollution, where from a product market standpoint, pollution will oftentimes be the byproduct of the production process of a firm, where this product of production we will refer to as a waste product, which we will define as the result of inefficient production, where resources were used to produce a particular good or service, but there were some leftover resources that were not transformed into the particular good or service in question, where an example of this is a car manufacturing plant that uses labor and machines to produce cars, but some leftover resources are converted to the waste product that causes air pollution in the form of smog, where additionally often these waste products of production will go unrealized by firms or consumers in the market. They will, however, be realized by some other agent that does not take place in the market, where, returning to that car market example from the previous slide, a firm produces a car along with the waste product of air pollution. The consumer purchases the car from the firm, and agents living near the car manufacturer bear the cost of the air polluting waste product as opposed to the consumer or the firm that just completed the transaction. So the reason that the third party agent bears the cost of the polluting waste product is that firms maximize profits using the rule of marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and consumers maximize utility using the rule of the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio, where in regards to that car manufacturing example, the cost structure of that waste product is not being stated in the cost structure of the production process, therefore it's not being embedded in marginal cost in the firm problem. Additionally, the price of that waste product is not being factored into the price of that good or service when consumers are making their purchasing decision. Therefore, it's not being factored into the consumer problem. Since it's not being considered in the firm or the consumer problem, this cost of the waste product has to go somewhere, so it will go to that third-party agent, where this then leaves a non-market participant to take up that cost overall as a consequence. Where overall then, the scenario that is being described here is that there are external costs present, where external costs can be defined as cost of a market activity borne by a third party, where this is going to be the difference between private costs and social costs in market transactions, where we will define private costs as the cost of an economic activity directly borne by the immediate consumer or firm, and we can think of this as the cost to produce a good or service by the firm, or the cost to purchase a good or service by consumers. Similarly, we have social costs, which are going to be the full resource cost of an economic activity, which will include externalities, which we can think of as the cost to produce the good or service, including the cost of the waste product as well, and this will be from the perspective of the firm. And from the perspective of the consumer, this is going to be the cost to purchase the good or service, including the cost of waste products. Then, mathematically, using our private and social costs then, we can then state external costs, just as the secondary definition suggests, as the difference between social costs and private costs, where, since we are assuming the waste product comes from production, we will focus on these cost structures from the point of view of the firm. So, now given our formula for external costs from the prior slide, and that external cost is equal to the difference between social and private costs, we see that external costs exist whenever a firm does not take into account the full social cost of production. In that, when we have our private costs from the firm and we take the difference from our social costs, we will have a positive value such that we will have positive external costs. That is, the firm considers the cost of producing the good but not the waste product, where the cost of the waste product is then borne by our third parties. By not internalizing the cost of the waste product, true costs are understated such that marginal costs will be understated as a result. Thus, even if we suppose that a firm is operating in a perfectly competitive market structure where marginal cost pricing does occur, we will have market failure, since although we will have the true price point, true marginal costs are not being realized in the pricing decision. Therefore, we will not have true marginal cost pricing. To examine this, let us look at this graphically, where on the right we have a graph of a perfectly competitive firm where we have price on the vertical axis and we have quantity of output on the horizontal axis in terms of kilowatt hours per day. We have our horizontal marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive firm, which we know is their price point as well. And the first curve that we will consider in terms of our cost structure will be this upward sloping blue marginal cost curve, solely corresponding to our private marginal costs. So that is the cost to produce the good or service, in which the waste product is not considered as well. We know in terms of profit maximizing behavior for a perfectly competitive firm, this is going to be when price is equal to marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. This occurs at point B at the corresponding price point of the marginal revenue curve with the output level QP, where in regards to this outcome for this particular firm, we have that price is equal to marginal revenue is equal to private marginal cost, which has the effect of market failure, in that although we have the required price level, costs are understated in that the firm is not realizing the cost of their waste product. Therefore, there will be too much output in the market. However, if the firm internalizes the cost of production of this waste product as well as for their good or service, this will then increase their costs, and with this increased cost structure that reflects the true cost, we will also have an increase in marginal cost, and we'll have the true marginal cost curve to consider. And this will be our social marginal cost curve that we'll have on the left in red that is also upward sloping, going through this profit maximizing decision for the competitive firm when they realize the production cost of their good as well as their waste product. Marginal revenue is equal to price is equal to marginal cost. We see this gives us the corresponding price point at the marginal revenue curve as before, so we have our true price point still. And in terms of our optimal level of output for this particular firm, we see we have an output level QS, which is strictly less than before when the firm was solely realizing the cost of production for their good or service, but not for the waste product. So then overall what we have then is when price is equal to marginal revenue is equal to social marginal costs, we have marginal cost pricing in that we have the required price level, which was satisfied before, but now we have that costs are being accurately stated in that we're considering the cost to produce the good or service as well as the waste product, and the outcome in the market then is a reduced level of output as compared to when only private costs are being considered by the firm. So then overall what we saw then is market failure exists if external costs exist, and in order to reduce pollution and correct market failure, firms must internalize the cost of production to their goods as well as for their waste products. So where we'll pick up in our next video then is we will see how a government can regulate such instances of market failure.